Thank you for joining us on the Going Deeper podcast, a ministry of Fathom Church in Littleton, Colorado. You will never get to the bottom of the depths that are in Christ for you. And our hope with this podcast is that it will help you go deeper with God. So let's dive into this episode of the Going Deeper podcast. What's up, everyone? This is your host, Kyle Knight, and welcome to the Going Deeper podcast, a podcast where we just have conversations to hopefully help you go deeper in your relationship with God. I'm in the podcast studio here at Fathom Church. Karina is off again this week, so you've got me and Pastor Chris Martin here.
Buenos dias.
Going back to Spanish. How many languages do you know?
So many.
So
many
if you've been
languages.
listening to this, you know. Yeah, he has
gonna
a
need
wide
to-
range.
I'm going to need to really
diverse.
polish up on my diversity. Yeah.
Yes. Hey, church, as you can see by the title of this episode, we're going to be talking about really like church sizes, big churches versus small churches. Is one better than the other? Our kind of preferences, maybe some statistics about, the American church now and what this kind of has to do with us here at Fathom Church.
Mhm.
An interesting topic. So definitely something as you're reading statistics about and you're kind of always in the church, like the background of the church, the behind the scenes again, like we are, and thinking of numbers and all that kind of stuff and sizes of churches. It's an interesting topic, and it's
Right.
definitely something now I think that we see. I mean, you see all over the place of people going from one to the other and their preferences and everything like that. So I think where we can start is, Chris, I know you didn't grow up as a Christian until you got to later teen years, but kind of just tell us, like, we'll go back and forth a little bit about maybe what you grew up with a little bit as your first few churches of large and small, like how big
Yeah.
and small they were, maybe your preferences, what you liked about one or the other, and then we'll go from there.
Cool. Yeah. So yeah, I didn't go to church growing up, but got saved in high school and was a part of a youth group in a larger. Like there's lots of large means different things to different people, but it was
Like, we should
probably
say that at the
like
top,
1,000 people at this
Yeah.
church. And so
which is very large.
that's large. I mean, it's
Really.
not mega,
Right.
but it's large.
Mhm.
So that's my church experience for the last couple of years of high school was a larger church, big building, youth group with, 30 or 40 kids in it, just kind of that vibe. Then I went to college, moved up to Denver to go to CCU. And during college, I pretty much went to smaller churches.
Mhm.
Landed finally after a kind of a year or maybe a year and a half of just trying things out. I landed in a little Baptist church, little Southern Baptist church, and probably 75 people in this little
Mhm.
church. But expository preaching, kind of Christ-centered worship. It was just kind of a good conservative little Baptist church. But when I finished undergrad, I got employed by a church. And so from there on out till now,
Mhm.
my church life has been mingled with my work life,
Right.
which
Right.
is a strange phenomenon. But
Yeah.
the church I got hired at was the church that I met you at, Kyle,
Mhm.
up in Arvada. And I think at that time, that church was maybe 1,200-ish. I don't know.
Sure.
I have no
Yeah.
idea. But it was pretty big,
Yeah.
big building, big facility. They had,
Mhm.
3 youth staff members. So
Mhm.
that'll kind of put that in your mind. There was a high school, a junior high, and then a kind of director. And so
Right.
there was a lot of stuff happening there, but was there. And then I got hired on when I got married to a bigger church, a church of 3,000.
Mm.
So bigger, still not mega, but large
Right.
for sure. And then after that, man, I went and worked at a church of about 150, 200 folks, and was there for 6-7 years and really deeply embedded myself into a smaller church.
Mhm.
And then after that church, I planted Fathom.
Yeah.
And so Fathom was, 20 people when we first started. And now we're about 250 on a Sunday. And that's, so we're still in that small category, but we're kind of right on the brink. That 200 to 250 mark is kind of where small churches stop and mid-sized churches enter into the equation. And so that's been my journey. I'd love to hear yours a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned the church that I grew up in already. But yeah, that was a fairly large church, I would
Right.
say. Yeah, youth group was pretty huge, both in middle school and high school, and the kids was big. And so that was the church I grew up in. I feel like I've most of me attending church throughout my life, they've been pretty much the same, really, like with size wise, pretty much the same, until I got here at Fathom. But yeah, after I graduated from high school and went to CU Boulder, I attended a First Pres church up there. And that was just the college group. Like that was just something that they had a huge college ministry there. And so that was kind of even separate from the actual First Presbyterian Church there. But the college group there was just, it was big. It was huge. So lots of college students there in that group. And then after that, after a little bit of time figuring out what I was going to do with my life, then getting into seminary is when I got my first job in ministry. And you're right. It's like, it's kind of a different thing when you're like attending a church growing up and everything, and then getting a job in ministry and in a church. And so my first job in ministry was, I'd say, like probably pretty similar to in size in the church I grew up with, maybe a little bit smaller. It was one of the biggest things. It was a little bit, the demographic there was a little bit older, but it was also a mountain church, so it was up in Genesee, Evergreen area, and so that mattered. But it was still I would say a medium to large size church. And we were there for 7 years or so. And then I took, and what's interesting is I took a little bit of a break from ministry and did some other things for a year and a half or so. And then we attended church, and we attended a very big church, a mega church. So we liked it. We liked things about it. But then it's interesting how we transitioned from there. And then if you know our story, feeling just like a call back into ministry, and especially for me to have my family back in ministry as well and be connected with the church on a deeper level than just attending, felt like God was calling me back to that. That is when I talked to you, Chris, and started working here at Fathom.
Well, so and even just in that, I mean, you came we hired Kyle. We hired Kyle 3 months after the COVID lockdown started. And so our church had shrunk down to less than 100 by that point. And so you came into this church when it was really still pretty small. I mean, kind of almost like a replant in some ways. And it's kind of gone through some iterations, but in the last 4 years, it's started to make the shift from kind of that traditionally small church into kind of a more mid-sized church for sure.
Yeah. So our, like me and my family's time attending a mega church for a little while, and then coming here to Fathom when it was sort of a replant thing with COVID and everything. And then to where we're at now. This is the smallest church I've been a part of. But yeah, I guess, Chris, we could go into a little bit about, like, what are maybe not like what are the good things and bad things, because church, if you're listening, like, like if you call Fathom Church your home, you are most likely one that, you like the smaller church feel. When we've had a bunch of people come from the big churches here. We've had some leave here and go to bigger church. It's what happens. And so we won't go through the pros and cons of each, because you're here at Fathom because you like the size of it and other things. So, but Chris, what are some of the things that you like about maybe a size of church that Fathom is? What are some things that you like about bigger churches, and then maybe some things that aren't your preference?
Right. Yeah. Well, so, I mean, one of the things that I hear from people, whenever it's, hey, what do you love about the church? Or what are you looking for a church? Things like that. I always see, I mean, we hear some iteration of this from most people at our church. Oh, we really love the size.
Yeah.
Why are you here? Oh, I just love the size. I think the size of this church is good. And I think I have a hunch that by size, they don't necessarily mean the size of the room.
Is it the building?
Or the size of the building, or even specifically the number of people. I think what people really love is the intimacy,
Mm-hmm.
the ability to know people and be known by people,
Yeah.
the access to leaders, right? The intentionality of shepherding from the leaders of the church.
Mm-hmm.
Even some of it does come down to feel, right? You go to a mega church and you're in a room with a couple thousand people.
Yep.
It's going to feel very different. But my sense is that the size question tends to be about relationships and intimacy.
Mm-hmm.
So here's what my experience has been working in bigger churches and now working in smaller churches is that with smaller churches, it's easier to have that kind of relational intimacy. It just is because of the nature of group dynamics, it's easier. Now, hear me, there are some small churches where that group, that in crowd can become ingrown.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is not like an inherent value that all small churches hold is relational intimacy and accessibility to leaders and people and things like that. It is not inherent in every little church.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the things that we very much value at Fathom is developing our communities. We say all the time, Fathom is not the church where you know everybody. It's the church where everybody's known. And that's kind of part of, some of that is just based on how we've structured things. Some of that is based on the building. It's just like I say it from the stage all the time. It's really hard to hide at a church like ours.
Right.
And that's just part and parcel to it. So that's inherent in a small church. It's easier to develop that kind of intimacy. Sometimes it can be feigned intimacy, but it's easier. Right. In a larger church, that kind of intimacy can be found. Mm-hmm. So I don't want to, that I don't want to downplay. As a church grows, though, it must be hyper intentional, and it becomes much more difficult and needing structures, systems, and strategy to essentially make the church smaller for a person as it grows bigger. So this is where the small group model kind of came into play. And even, we say this at Fathom, even at our church, you can't know 250 people, but you can know 12. And that's why we do small groups, is we are intentionally trying to do small, even as we are, the larger group isn't that big, but it's still too big for everybody. Right. And so I think the same thing applies to bigger churches. Like bigger churches can do intimacy well. They just have to do it in a different way. And they have to be far more intentional, because you won't accidentally enter into a community in a larger church. It must be more intentional.
Right.
So I think that's a big piece of kind of the small. The other piece that I've already mentioned a little bit is the shepherding piece. So that's one of our high values for our elders, is that the elders shepherd the members of the church. And so we've got like 160 men, women, and children who are in our membership, something like that. And the elders then split them up into shepherding groups, and we kind of know and walk alongside of people and check in on them and pray for them and things like that. So, if the church doubled in size or something, shepherding becomes it just always needs to be asked, how do the elders shepherd? If elder is shepherd in the New Testament, how do they do that? Do they do that individually? Do they do that as a group? Do they do that through small group leaders? Do they how does shepherding happen? And my guess is most larger churches don't really have a plan for how the members are shepherded. They think programs shepherd people, and that's unfortunate. But I do know some larger churches who would say, no, we have a system for shepherding. It's just far more complex than your little system for shepherding. And I hear that. Yeah. But I do think smaller does lend itself to easier and more intimate shepherding. And you just have to, again, work harder as a church gets bigger to do that well.
Yeah. And to be honest, that's like me and my wife's story right there. And we really relate to that because, after I was done with my season of doing youth ministry at a different church, and we had a little bit of time where I wasn't working in ministry and I was doing something else, and we attended one of those big mega churches. One of the things for me personally is I was at a stage in my life that I wanted the big church, and I was fine with it because I kind of wanted to hide a little bit within the couple thousand other people that were in the auditorium each Sunday or Saturday or whenever the service was. I was at a place where I was like, you know what, I'm okay not necessarily being known. My introvertedness was like, I can go sit in the back or something like that. Now, the difficult thing, and maybe not difficult thing, the blessing is that my wife is the complete opposite of me. And she is like, she's like, she loves even the big church feel, but she is like, okay, how can I get connected to a small, like, give me in a group, give me all this kind of stuff. And for me at that stage, I was like, no, I'm fine with, like, at least for now, I'm fine with being in the back. You know, I can turn my church brain off from what I used to experience and everything like that. However, that led us into, I mean, that was a short season for us because it led us into going like, you know, hey, we do miss that, whether it was the small church feel, I missed working in ministry and working on a church staff and with a church and everything. But it was like, we both kind of, as we were part of this big church for just a short amount of time, like my wife went to a few kind of small group sort of things, some MOPS things, some mom things. And, but still it was like, yeah, we were just missing we were missing that intimacy, that community, not knowing that, hey, at that point we didn't know like, hey, Fathom was just right around the corner and this was the size of it. I knew nothing about where Fathom was at that point. Mm-hmm. But it was just definitely a huge blessing getting us back into a community that was smaller, but also very intentional for me and my family to come along, with my wife being able to, you know, be with other women a lot, in different groups. And they, like you said, knowing other women, but them knowing her, but then also having my kids too. And being at a place where they're not going to get kind of overlooked or lost, with the other 70 kids that are in their class or something like that. So yeah, so that's an interesting thing about us, is we had a little bit of time that we kind of went from one extreme to the other extreme. And obviously now we're like, just what a blessing it was to, and new for me and my family to be in a smaller, just more intimate church. But yeah, that's kind of
but it's even interesting as you say, tell us that one of the, I think, benefits of a larger church you've already mentioned is that, like, you didn't know about Fathom.
Yeah.
Right. Like that's one of the inherent downsides to a smaller church, is that people don't know about it. Right.
I knew you, so I did know it, but that's a very special,
a special case.
Oh yeah. If I didn't know you, I would not have.
And so that's a benefit of a bigger church, is that if someone's like looking, they're likely going to find that.
Sure.
And that might be okay, depending on how good that church is. Right. Because there are good big churches, and then there are not so good big churches, just like there are good small churches. And listen, we've all, maybe not we've all, but I've certainly walked into small churches where I'm like, whoa, no way. No way. Yeah. So I think sometimes, depending on your preference, we will automatically assign a value to either big or small.
Oh, yeah.
That big is good and small is bad, or small is good and big is bad. And I think that's just a bit too simplistic. Because there are pros and there are cons. And so, yeah, I think it's an interesting conversation, especially in our case. So we're a smaller church. But we've grown in the last couple of years, and indications point that we're going to keep growing. And so let me ask you this question, because as a church grows, how should a member of that church deal with that? Like, oh, I came here when there was 100 people, and there was one service. And now there's multiple services, and they're hiring more staff, and they're talking about a new building, and there's a ton of people that I don't know. And, you know, like, so you talk to or coach members of our church or any church really, who the church that I came to is growing,
right?
Which I think most people would say that's good as long as it's not some sort of sensational, attractional. We just, sent flyers all over the town. Like we are growing organically by people inviting and people finding our church. We're not trying to like grow in that way rapidly, but talk to us about that. How would you coach somebody?
Yeah. And I like how you said that, because I do think, and even I think this was me growing up too, that it was like if you do want to be a part of a smaller church and you join a smaller church and it just keeps growing, it should, especially organically, growing in the right ways of like, you're getting new believers there, you're getting like friends, or people are inviting friends, everything like that. That should be a sense of like, this is great. Like more people are coming to know Jesus and coming to be discipled at a church. But it's a bummer that sometimes that turns into a little bit of like, oh, I don't want this. Like, I don't want, I joined, Fathom when it was a small church, and now it's getting too big. Is it going to get too big for me? Is it going to get so there's always those feelings of like, well, I don't want it to be a big church. I want it to be like, stay small. It's like, okay. And I agree with that. It's like, yeah, we would want it to stay small. And like you talked about that, we would want it to stay small in, I guess, the feel of it, but the intentionality behind it, the care you put into it. And so I guess my suggestion, what I would say to some of those people, because we know there are some of those people here at Fathom too, that like Fathom's growing, and it's we grew a lot this year, and you're right. There's all indications to say that we're going to keep growing, and Lord willing, at some point we might be in a new building that could facilitate more growth, and that we could just like, we want to see more people come to know Jesus and be discipled here. And so those who are maybe maybe they came to Fathom when it was small because they're against big church. Like they were at a big church and they had some church hurt. And they don't want to see Fathom become that. My kind of 2 cents, my encouragement to them is really just, to me, that it's a heart thing. It's a heart issue thing, that it's like, those people who have that kind of sense of like, oh, or that attitude of like, oh, well, if it gets too big, I don't want to be a part of this or anything like that. It's like, well, then I would say like, you can do the hard work on yourself and do that work with the Lord of like, why are you at a church to begin with? Like, is the size of it really important? Is the number of people like that important to you that you would bail and go somewhere else? But to me, it's a heart thing. Like, you want to see people, like we want to see Fathom grow in the right ways and people coming to know Christ, not in the crazy ways of like, we're going to do so much programming and throw money at a bunch of stuff and get kind of that superficial number way up there, but not see people really grow in their relationship with God. I mean, our whole thing is going deeper. But I feel like most churches like us, like we could grow this thing like crazy, but not see people go deeper. So I'm like, my encouragement would be like, hey, if you're feeling like that, first of all, check your heart with the Lord, but also just continue to be intentional and to dive deeper into your relationship with God here on Sundays, but all the people around here. What I hear a lot, especially like in D groups and that kind of stuff, is like, yeah, if I attend even just our small size church, I attend one service. Like I always go to the 8:45 service. I never go to the 10 o'clock service or whatever it is, 10:45. But so I never see those people that go to the second service. So to me, it feels like there's 2 different churches and like I never see them and everything. I would say like, continue to be intentional and continue to get to know people, even if this church keeps growing. Like, continue to meet people, to help other people feel that they are known, and then continue to be in your group, continue to go to church. I guess my thing is like, just continue to like be a part of this, and don't like check out when things aren't kind of going your way or like you would hope it to be. Because I think that's the easy way out of like, oh, our church is doing something different that I don't really like. I'm just going to go find that other smaller church that's 100 people less. And then eventually that church might get there too. And then you're just kind of bouncing back and forth.
Yeah. And I think, I think the reality for our church is to know that Like we don't have any crazy delusions or aspirations towards being a mega church.
Yeah.
But we do want to see growth.
Yeah.
And the reason why I want to see growth is because I want my neighbors to come.
Yeah.
And I want your neighbors to come and your coworkers and your friends and your family. And 65% of our growth this year came because somebody invited somebody else. Yeah. And that's really awesome. So I always tell new people or people who say like, oh, I'm worried about the size or I like the size of the church. I always say, just remember at one point you wrecked the size for somebody else, right? Like when you came here, Kyle, when we hired you and you and your family showed up, like you made this place bigger.
Yeah.
And that's a little tongue in cheek, but then the other side of, and I think this is reasonable, is to say, would you rather be in a church that doesn't grow? Like, would you rather be in a church that it's the same 100 people for the next 20 years? Because I'll tell you this much, I'll find you that church.
Yeah.
They're a dime a dozen.
Yeah.
They're all over the place. The same people have been in the same building with the same other people for, 10, 20, 30 years. And it's not, some of that feels like romantic in a relational sense, but it's not because it's romantic in a relational sense. It's because they're unwilling to go out or they're unwilling to open up. And so I think that the other side of this is our mission is we want to see people go deep, but we also want to empower people to reach wide. And so that vision of go deep and reach wide means that a church should be growing and a church should be going.
Yeah.
It should be doing both. Yeah. And so my hope, my hope is that the church grows healthily. And yeah, like I do think there's a place for, hey, this thing is getting bigger than my preference. And I think there's a time and probably a good way to say the church no longer matches my preference, but I'd be real careful before hitting the eject button to make sure that it's not an unhealthy way of handling something that you don't like at a church. And man, I don't know. Like I feel like there are pros and cons to both sides.
Yeah.
And so our church is right on that cusp of no longer really being small enough to be considered small, but not anywhere near being big. We're kind of moving into a new season, as mid-sized church thing. And that will mean some pain, some growing pains. But gosh, I just trust that. I trust that God is doing this because we're not like manufacturing this growth with big, strategies and policies and campaigns and things like we're not trying to be kitschy in our growth. The Lord is just bringing harvest, and there's new believers and there's de-churched people and there's people who are friends and family and neighbors and people move into the area, and it's like, okay, welcome. You want to get in on this? Get on in here.
And that's, and I want maybe just a little encouragement to our church of that this is something that as an elder team and even as a staff, like we talk about constantly. Like we talk about the growth of our church, even just this past year, but also like we talk about, hey, how can we, because we do know when we do membership surveys, all that kind of stuff, we hear, the things that people like about Fathom. And one of those things is pretty consistently is like, yeah, I like the size of Fathom. I like the smaller church. I like the intimacy. I like the community of that. So then I do think when y'all hear that, oh, we're growing and that is good. And we're going to continue to grow and that can kind of freak some people out. But I want to encourage y'all that like, we talk about this a lot. And we also talk about like, how we continue to like, we always say like, we want as we grow and in numbers in a building, like physical growth, whatever that looks like, we are trying to do whatever we can to keep that small church feel. I mean, that's one of the things. This is really important to us, not to just be like, let's just keep growing and growing and growing and forget about, that discipleship, that community, those sorts of things.
And some of that you can play a part in too, church. Like you can make this place feel smaller by participating, by engaging with new people, by keeping your eyes open and your head on a swivel for the person who's sitting by themselves. Or, in some ways there's the strategy that comes from the staff and the elders for this, but then also from the members of our church to just say, hey, remember what it was like when you were new.
Yeah.
Like what it meant for somebody to say hi to you, for somebody to get to know you, for somebody to remember your name. And actually, the only way that a growing church can remain small is if everybody's kind of committed to that.
Yeah.
Because I promise you, it's not just going to be the staff or the elders that can pull this one off. That can be all of us. And actually, that's how a small church stays healthy too. Because the small church, once everybody knows everybody, it can turn inward as opposed to being open and welcoming to new people. And so that's maybe my encouragement is like, hey, as our church is in flux, keep welcoming people, keep encouraging people, getting to know people, inviting people into your home, join a small group. Gosh, if you've been in a small group, think about maybe multiplying and leading a new small group. I mean, there's lots of ways to get plugged in and actually help make this church the kind of church that we all want it to be. So that might be a commendation towards our church in that way.
Yeah, that's good. Do you have any last little things to say?
Love it, man. Yeah. Big church, small church. Who knows, man? I'm thinking we might just go all AI church. That's my next move.
Wow. I was going to say, we'll have some satellite campuses opening up. Fathom.
Well, I know that
Fathom Pueblo.
Well, we'll think about that. No, I'm thinking there's talk about like the metaverse and churches there, but what if we just skip the metaverse and go straight to AI?
Might as well.
Like I'll use ChatGPT to write sermons.
Yes.
And we will all just,
that'll be great.
I'm going to retire and let an AI pastor lead our church. What do you think?
You won't know the difference.
Big, small, it don't matter when the robots are in charge.
Oh, sounds like another conversation for a different podcast episode that we probably won't have because
I don't think so.
Don't want to talk about that. Hey, thank you, Pastor Chris, for having this conversation. Hopefully this was helpful to you, church. But hey, if you need anything, please reach out to us. Know that we are always here for you. Reach out to your shepherding elder if you're a member here. But we love you, church. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next time.